Hey everyone, and welcome to our July live event for National Quilter Circle. Once again, we have Colleen back to answer some of your quilting questions. So thanks for being here, Colleen.
Thanks for having me.
Oh,
Seems
of
like
course.
so long since we've talked. Oh my.
I know. We were saying we only took a month off, but it feels like forever. So we are
Mhm.
back and ready to go. And we see that people are already starting to ask questions, which is perfect. So we have some that are in that we'll get started on right away. But of course, if you're watching and have questions of your own for Colleen, please put those in the chat box. And you'll see it's a little orange chat box. That's the one that's going to get to us live right now. The other one kind of just goes to customer service, which we still do answer. You just won't be able to see it live. So make sure you're putting it in the right live chat box. But our first question here, this is from Pamela, and she says that she has been sewing for over 40 years, but started quilting 2 years ago. I've read various opinions on thread use. Many say use cotton thread only, others say polyester. Which is best, or are they basically the same?
That is a really good question. There are quilt purists that want to use everything cotton. So that means that their piecing fabric is 100% cotton, their batting is 100% cotton, their backing is 100% cotton, and including the thread they piece with. And that's what they want. They want everything cotton, so it all shrinks at about the same rate. But there really isn't a guarantee that everything will shrink at the same rate because fabrics are woven differently and things. If you were trying to create a quilt that will last for 100 years or 150 years to basically outlast you, a cotton would probably be the way to go because it reacts the same as the material you're piecing with, your backing will be. So 100% cotton is good for very long-term quilts. Polyester gets used by a lot of us in the quilt world, or a blend of fibers. Some say that polyester, since it's so strong, can actually cut through the fabric over time and actually damage the quilt. I use my quilts to be, or I create my quilts to be used and used a lot. If you were to see my grandkids' quilts, they've been drug around. They've been taken to picnics and out in the snow for warmth in the car. They've been used as tents. They've been used and over. So those quilts are going to wear out no matter what kind of thread I use. And I'm okay with that. So you have to kind of decide what you're comfortable with. The cost can also be different between the polyester and the 100% cotton. So that also might influence what you decide to choose. If you're just getting started, you may go with a little bit lower cost until your piecing it becomes very advanced, and then you may switch to cotton. But it's really a personal choice. It also depends on availability of where you're at. If you have that shop that you can stop in and get that perfect spool of thread, that's what you're going to use.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to think that if you've been sewing for 40 years, probably you're used to, I think the first, I don't know, half of the time I was ever sewing, it was just all purpose thread, which is a cotton
Mhm.
polyester blend. So I probably wouldn't ever pick 100% cotton and I'd never pick 100% poly. I'm just going to get that all purpose thread and use it for everything because it's
That's
easier.
yeah, that's exactly what I did recently when I was doing some sewing, and I thought, you know what? I have all of these bobbins that have just a little bit on all of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's in a dark colored quilt. No one's going to see the thread. I used up 13 bobbins that day. Look, I have empty bobbins again. I can put a lot of yards on, and then I don't have to, by
Mm-hmm.
doing just one day of clean up sewing on those bobbins.
Yep.
If somebody ever gets to the back of my quilt, then I guess that's what they're going to see. But you know,
Well,
it'll
I
help.
hear you're getting your own long arm quilt machine, so you're going to be doing all of your quilting, which means no one's going to ever see the back of your quilt, so you're safe.
Exactly.
Perfect.
It'll be safe.
Yes. All right. Our next question here. I have several quilts I have finished but don't have homes for yet. I cut up some pool noodles and put them on a bar of a hanger and then hung my quilts on them in a closet covered with a plastic bag open at the bottom. Is this a good way to store them or not? Thank you, and I enjoy the program, and I'm always learning something new.
That is a pretty good way to store them. They're going to be kept dust free with a tent over it. It's not airtight so that the fibers can breathe some. The pool noodle will help from getting extreme creases, or if you were using a wire hanger, from getting, even if something happened to rust, it would protect the fibers. So it's okay to store them for a while that way, but make sure you get them quilted. The idea of creating tops is to have a finished quilt when we're done. So don't forget about them. Put them in line, like kind of giving them priority so that you keep shifting. So somebody goes off to the quilter or goes to your machine and actually turns into a quilt, because sometimes we can piece a lot faster than we can quilt.
Absolutely. So I know my mom's probably watching, and I know she has several quilt tops hung on hangers in a closet that she also needs to get quilted. But when I read that question, I thought it as to be finished quilts, because she mentions that she has quilts that just don't have homes. So is that still a good way to store? Would you store a quilt top that hasn't been quilted the same way that you would store a finished, fully done quilt bound? You just, haven't gifted it to someone, or you don't have it on a bed yet. Would you store them the same or treat them differently?
As long as you have an area, if it's in a closet that's temperature controlled, humidity controlled, it's not going to be in any direct sunlight, it's going to be okay there. Putting it into a cardboard box, you can, cardboard paper can somehow leach chemicals into the fibers and damage the quilt. So it's okay there temporarily, but find homes for them. Quilts are meant to be loved. And, we share our joy. I know a lot of quilters that don't keep any of their quilts. So they'll find homes, but have that be their temporary location.
Perfect. All right, our next question here. I've been quilting for 10 years and still have trouble getting my seams to match up perfectly, especially angled ones, no matter how careful I cut and sew. Any suggestions?
Close counts. I came to that conclusion the other day when I was working on the quilt called Bali Breeze that I did present here at National Quilt Circle. There is a point at which we just have to breathe and let it go. If it's off by a lot, here's my cheat version. If I'm trying to get an intersection, say, maybe it's triangles or something that's coming together, if I've got my pin or a Wonder Clip holding that, sometimes what I will do is put that under the machine, but instead of starting at the beginning of the piecing, I'll start right where the intersection is. So one direction to the outside edge, flip it over, go back from that center and go the other way out. So that what you're doing is basically starting at the center and working your way to the outer edge. If it's absolutely imperative, then you want that exact piece to be lined up. That way you don't shift one over the other as you're going past. You're starting in the center and working your way out. So if you're doing some, Lone Star or something with a beautiful center, that might be the ticket to get that center to stop from shifting. But on the third try, breathe and leave it. Because it's at that point, you're going to have a hard time tearing it apart. You might be frustrated. You could damage your fabric. And that's the saddest part if you get to that point. So try that trick. Start in the center and work your way out and see if that helps.
Absolutely. And a lot of times you'll be so focused on the pieces that you're putting together and it's not matching up. But by the time you get that into your finished quilt and then your quilt is quilted, you're probably never even going to notice the spot that you're focusing on right now. Yeah, exactly. You can hide a lot with some quilting too.
Exactly.
All right. Erin asks, I usually have trouble deciding what type of quilting I want to do on the top. Any suggestions on how to decide on a design to highlight the quilt top design?
Okay. That's what I'm going to be focusing on more and more as I get into long arming. I have long armed in the past. I don't do a lot of custom quilting. I do a lot of edge to edge utility quilting, but study the quilt. Let it kind of speak to you. Decide. The quilt behind me, the purple and the turquoise, all those angles, very sharpish is what I always think of the pineapple blocks with all those points. It needed some curve. So I quilted a lot of curve into that design just to soften it. When you look close, you see a curve that kind of undulates through the design. So sometimes when something's extremely angular, adding a curve kind of softens the overall effect. If you have a lot of negative space, a lot of open space, be either wide sashing or a lot of background, those are some areas that you can add some fun quilting, possibly maybe with matching thread, so it's not a real strong contrast, but maybe go and doing something very custom in those areas.
Mhm.
A lot of times you kind of need to sit and look at it for a while to decide, let it kind of speak. Do I need to add curves? Do I need to add lines? Is it a very modern quilt? Do I want to do something very simple, not overplayed, not too dense in that quilt? So you kind of need to do that. And the other thing, we have Google Images. Search ideas. There are a lot of machine quilting ideas out there, and something will pop up and say, I belong on that quilt.
Mhm.
So the little research also, what you can do is either photograph or put your quilt in a scanner and then take that block and play on it, or put it in a sleeve plastic, clear plastic sleeve protector, and use a dry erase marker and draw ideas on it. And you can erase and try again until you find something you like. A friend of mine who long arms does that a lot until she all of a sudden says, "Ooh, that's what I need on this quilt." So she plays for a little while. It's not always instantaneous what we want to do on a quilt. So take a little time, breathe, do a little research, do a little doodle.
Yep. I think it's funny that you say take time, like look at it and say it'll speak to you, because that's exactly the person I send my quilts to get quilted. Same thing. She says, I'll figure out what to quilt on it when I get it, because I need to let it talk to me, and figure out. So, and the more you do it, the more you'll just kind of have ideas pop into your head, or you'll have sort of a favorite or a go-to or something looks good on this, So
Yep,
yeah,
exactly.
practice makes perfect.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I guess says, I always have a hard time cutting the exact measurements, whether it's a square size or triangle. It's always off on one side. Is there a trick to cutting?
Off on one side. Okay. It may be the angle that you're cutting at. Now, some people will cut, say, strips and then turn the strip and cut pieces off. I have seen people put a ruler down and cut around and come back this direction. When you start using the rotary cutter at odd angles, you do usually have a margin of error, because the position at which you're holding that blade either isn't exactly perpendicular anymore. It might be at a wedge shape coming out off that ruler, and that will make your cutting off. So always try to position your fabric and your rotary cutter so you're pushing out and away from yourself. Reposition, maybe you don't want to reposition the fabric, but maybe use a smaller mat so you can turn the mat and again be pushing away from you so you get that perfect cut every time. Because a lot of times I think error comes with the positioning of how we're holding our rotary cutter. The other thing is, you might be, if you're using your mat grid for measuring, try to go to the ruler instead. I know it's hard for some people who have started using the mat at the very beginning as their measuring guide. But if you go just to the ruler, because that ruler will hold it down and you'll have an exact cut, you'll get a little better accuracy if you can just stick with the reading on your ruler instead.
Yeah, I agree. Or because I know I do use my mat occasionally as well, but just be consistent with using one or the other. So like you mentioned cutting strips, and like I would cut a strip and use, say my really long ruler and use that to line it up. But then once I have my little strip and I have it on my cutting mat, then I would like go to using the lines on the mat to cut my pieces. So that's where it's like sort of pick one or the other. Are you going to use a ruler all the time or a mat all the time? So that could help too.
Yep.
Our next one here, should I baste the edges of my quilt sandwich before attaching the binding?
I would only do that if the outer edge, and I would do it even before it was sent to the quilter. I have had some quilts, like even the one behind me, because the way of the ruler, it's a trim ruler. It has a lot of bias edges on the outside of the blocks, which then occurred on the outside of my quilt. I went ahead and based, I didn't really baste, but I did a stay stitch kind of along the outer edge just so that it wouldn't get distorted when being put onto the long arm. So I think if you felt that there was a distortion there, do it early. If you're using a high loft batting, like a poly or a wool, and there's a lot of thickness there, and it's kind of flayed apart along the edge, you may want to go back and do a real simple baste along that outer edge. just so that it doesn't shift when you're trying to put your binding on. Because if you've got a thick batting in there, like a poly or a double wool or something, if you've done something for Trapunto or some fancy thing, you may need to slowly walk along that and baste it down that edge, just so that you don't get tucks and little pleats along the edge as you apply your binding. So there are times when that is helpful.
So when it comes to your basting or stay stitching, with just the quilt top, you're going to stay stitch it if you don't want it to be started before you quilt it, right? But then you don't want to be doing any basting of the edges of the entire sandwich until it's been quilted, correct?
Right. Because it's that batting that may cause that extra fluff, and you're trying to deal with binding and maybe getting corners, and you've got layers underneath you can't see. And that's happened to me before. I mean, I get a little tuck and then I'm like, uh-oh, to go back and ease them down and stitch it. So I can see where it works sometimes.
Perfect. All right, our next question here. What is the best advice for selection of a frame for those of us who like to hand quilt? Any comments on the PVC type?
I am not a hand quilter, so that's going to be a tough question for me. A friend of mine who is a hand quilter uses a hoop on her lap. But I believe there are some people that I do know that do use the PVC pipe type of hand quilting mechanism. It usually comes with a stand, so you don't have it on your lap. It's not quite as warm. You get a little air underneath there, especially in the summertime. I think they can be helpful in their appropriate situation. It's going to take some time to get used to, probably, but they can be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say, I also am not a hand quilter. I'm not patient enough for that. But I have seen other people who have done it, and the ones I always see used, to me, always look like wooden frames. I don't know that I've ever seen the PVC type, but I'm going to assume that there's a price difference too between PVC and a nice wooden frame. So maybe take all of those kind of things into consideration when picking your quilt frame. Next one here. How much of a difference does it make between straight or bias binding on a quilt?
There's a difference in yardage. So when you're going to cut bias binding, you're going to need additional yardage, and so that you don't have seam after seam after seam when you're joining it. There are techniques for making continuous bias binding online that you can go to. At some point, you will end up with seams very close together as you do cut up the entire spiral. I usually only go to doing bias binding when I have either an outside curve or an inside curve on the exterior edge of my quilt. Unless I fall in love with a stripe or a plaid that just has to be the binding on the outer edge of my quilt. And if it's printed or woven in with straight of grain, the only way you get that little bias crosshatch on the edge or the diagonal stripe would be to cut bias binding. So you're going to need more yardage, probably an additional, I don't know, depends on what size your quilt is, an additional maybe third of a yard in order to do bias binding and get those nice long strips. I tend to do straight of grain binding most of the time just because of cost. But there have been times when I had to have the plaid or I had to have the stripe, and the only stripe I could find was printed straight of grain, so I had to cut bias pieces. So it's one of those things you have to invest in if you want to do it.
That's funny. I never would have thought about the direction of the stripe and cutting a bias to get it that way, because I always have done straight grain binding too, just because it's just so much easier. You're just cutting the strips and then they're long. I don't know. I would always pick straight grain, like I said, unless there's a curve that makes a bias edge necessary.
Correct. And if you're going to be doing bias strips, make sure that you either start your fabric ahead of time with some Best Press or some kind of product so that you don't stretch, because if you stretch as you apply that to your quilt, the outer edge of your quilt is going to curl just a tiny bit, and that will make you sad.
Yeah. The giant bowl effect.
Yes.
Maddie says, I am making my first Dresden plate and my wedges are not fitting correctly. Any tips or tricks?
Okay. Double check to make sure that if you're using a template, you cut your template or downloaded your template correctly. Make sure that if you download it from your computer, that it's actually a size it needs to be. If it's off by just a little, if it's just, there's just a hair of a difference and it's just a little too big, the ticket is to go back and slim in, just take a tiny in extra deep seams and just a couple. And when I say extra deep seam, like by one thread difference until you get it to lay flat, because that the eye will correct. Even if you're just taking a little tiny bit in like every other one, there won't be enough difference in the actual dimensions of each of those blades. Nobody will know that you did that. And I've done that too. I did test blocks for Fons and Porter, and there were times when we were preparing something and it's like either I distorted it a little in the cutting or I distorted it in the pressing. So by taking that just a little tiny bit more in a few of the seams, it's usually enough to let it relax and be perfectly flat. So
Yeah.
no one sees the back. It's okay.
Exactly. And I've been known to, if it's the center that's not fitting, say the center is just a little too big, just kind of fudge it a little bit in the pressing almost too. You can kind of get, just hide those edges under there. And then this is just sort of a random thing, but I did it the very first time that I was making a Dresden. And I cut out one too many blades. And I already had everything together. And I'm like, it's really not going to fit, so double check, double count, make sure, that you have the correct number too, because then that will make it look like it's off a lot. And you're really going to be like, I don't know what I'm doing. But yeah, double count.
Overzealous in the cutting. I just wanted to make sure.
Excited. I don't know. Okay. Erin wants to know, how do you find someone to quilt your quilt for you? How to know that they are good or not? Do you have an idea of how to quilt it? What is a good price? Anything else I need to know before sending out my quilt?
Vetting a long armor. If you have any quilt friends, talk to them about who does their quilting. Mm-hmm. Talk to people in quilt shops. They usually will recommend someone that they feel comfortable with their own quilts. So that would give you at least some semblance of calm. When you contact them, you can ask for either photographs or to meet with them and see. Right now, it'd probably be a virtual meeting to see some of their quilting. So you know what their quilting looks like, how dense they quilt, how closely they actually listen to you as the creator of the quilt top. Some quilters will take a quilt and just do what they want, and others are very good at listening and understanding what you're looking for in your design. Cost can change a little bit across the country. From most of the chats I've seen, anywhere, if you're talking about edge-to-edge quilting, it's anywhere from 1.50 to 2 cents a square inch. That's a very simple edge-to-edge design, nothing custom, nothing fancy there. And then it works its way up usually by 0.5 cents an inch in increments from there. A quilt can go as low as $120. It could end up at $650. Mm-hmm. So really speak with them a lot so that you know what it could cost. Take the dimensions of your quilt. If it is 80 inches across by 85 long, take those two numbers, times each other, and then times 0.02. That would be about an average for 2 cents a square inch for an overall quilt design. And so you'll know that that's the cost of the quilting. Now, there may be a thread charge on top of that. You're going to need to provide your own batting. If you didn't piece your back, somebody may charge you to piece the back. So those are all things to consider. Try to take the quilt top, get your batting, unless your long armor prefers a certain kind and they have it available. And so you know what you're going into ahead of time. So you know what the charges are going to be. So yeah.
Absolutely. And then I think, like you said, if you can get somebody's opinion or use a quilter that someone else has already used, that's how I found who I use now. And I haven't used anyone else since then. Like, it's just, she knows, what I like on there. And you can get to where, like you said, some quilters will just do what they want on a quilt. And sometimes they'll ask you specifically, what do you want? But once you find a quilter that you trust enough, you can just send them a quilt and just know that it's going to come back beautiful and not have to worry about it. So that's, you kind of build up that trust with the person too. And then the other thing you can have them do is bind it, which is my favorite part of having someone else do my quilt.
Yes, it does come at a premium for binding.
It does, but it's well
But
worth
if
the
you need to
money.
bind, that is a good service that some people
Yeah.
do. And I know of people who ship their quilts to a quilter. A friend of mine, they're the people that she quilts for. Some of them live in Arizona. They can't find a long armor near them. They ship their quilts, tops and backs, to Iowa, have her quilt them, and then she ships them back. So it's going to increase the cost because of the shipping, but there's more than one way to find a long armor, but you should be able to find somebody in your area, hopefully.
See, and I've always shipped mine too, and coincidentally enough, also to Iowa. She's always been in Iowa. I have never been in Iowa. I've been in Texas. Now I'm in Colorado. Like, I've never lived near her. But so, even a big king size quilt, I can fold that down, and with the binding, because I always make the binding so she can handle the binding, I can get that in a large flat rate box. So we're looking, $15 to ship it. So it's not, in terms of what you're going to pay to have a king size quilt custom quilted,
Exactly.
the shipping is minimal. So,
and it's done.
Exactly. It comes back to you completely finished. It's amazing.
Yes.
Next one here, Cheyenne says, Daisy and Cora say hi, Grandma.
Oh, hi, Daisy. Hi, Cora. Those are my grandkids, or at least
If they have any quilting questions, they should throw them out here,
They just put up pictures of them laying on their quilts.
Perfect. Awesome. All right, our next one here, Ari says, hi all, I'm working on my first quilt and I'm using t-shirts. Any tips for a beginner?
Ah, very good. T-shirt quilts are very popular, especially this time of year. And then this year, especially, just to try to highlight the end of maybe a high school career or a college career. The biggest thing with t-shirts is try to have them washed and dried without fabric softener, no dryer sheets. That will help in the fusing process that you're going to attempt to do next. Once you have them all figured out approximately how many you want to use in the project, cut away the front of the shirt, usually up the sides, across the top, shoulder seams, and try to get just the portion you want to work with. There may be a design on the back that you want to use. There might be a design on a sleeve, on a logo you want to use. Okay. Get down to at least flat pieces of one thickness that you want to use. The next thing is that you need to stabilize those, because if you cut them to the exact size and then you move them off your cutting mat, they will never again be that perfect square or rectangle that you cut, because as you move it off the cutting mat, it's going to curl. The outer edges are going to curl. I have seen people accomplish quilts with no stabilizer, but I don't think I would ever do that. You can use Shape Flex is one that I use a lot. It's a woven, fusible. It almost looks like a gauze. It's very thin. You can see through it. And it's fusible on one side. There are other products out there that can be also used to put on the back. Cut those just a little larger than what you want the finished block to be cut out as. You'll need to apply it to the back of the t-shirt. In order to protect your ironing surface, I would advise to use a pressing mat or a applique pressing sheet. It's a protection for your ironing surface in case your iron would get too hot, and that way you won't mess up the iron-on designs, because most of those are done with inks. I haven't had them melt too often, but once in a while you will touch them with the tip of an iron. You can mess up a design, but then adhere that to the back. Follow the instructions for how hot the iron needs to be, how long the iron needs to be in place for it to fuse. Once it's fused, then you can take it back to the cutting table and cut out your blocks the size that you want. So once you've accomplished that, then you've created blocks that can be put together in any order, framed, created with anything your heart desires at that point. But getting them stabilized, you're going to be handling them a lot, cutting them apart, stabilizing them, cutting them again. So t-shirt quilts are an act of love. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Also, if you want some additional fun tips, or you want to hear about people talking about t-shirt quilts, so we have a podcast. National Quilter Circle has a podcast, and recently we did an episode with Jen and Mary Canizaro, who are a mother-daughter team and they do other quilting as well, but they do t-shirt quilts, and they just actually are publishing a book through C&T Publishing that's Beyond the Tee. So their whole thing is they make t-shirt quilts that don't look like t-shirt quilts. So they'll take, rather than just your standard, square cutting out around the motif, they'll make that the center of a friendship star block, or they'll make it, look more like what you think of a quilt look like, but it's all made out of t-shirt fabric. And so it's a super fun episode to listen to. And they also talk about, and I'm curious to know if you've heard of this. I haven't tried it yet. They just sent me some, but it's called Terial Magic. And it is like a spray that you can put on the fabric, and it makes it somewhat stiff and it stabilizes it, but then it does eventually wash out. So it sounds amazing, and I can't wait to try it, but I just got it in the mail and I haven't used it yet. But
and a new adventure.
So more fun info on t-shirt quilts if you want to listen to that episode and then look them up. They are very talented. All right, next one here, Cheryl says that she purchased her first wall quilt kit several years ago. I tried to cut the pieces correctly, but they were too small. Is there any advice you can give me so I can get this finished?
No, too small. Well, I'm assuming that means that there is excess fabric. So hopefully you haven't ditched the fabric that you cut your pieces out of. You can go back and creatively come up with a solution to link those pieces together to make them the size. It may not be the exact same design that was originally intended, but sometimes patterns are just really strong suggestions and they're not set in stone. So I would say go back, try to come up with a combination of maybe some spacer blocks, some pieces in there that you can add to finish out the project so that it can be completed. And you can enjoy it because evidently you were attracted to the design or the color or the pattern. So there are times when, okay, so I'll even admit something I did this last week when I wanted to use every piece of the strips from my Bali Breeze quilt. And I needed just a few more pieces. If you look at old antique quilts, they actually took the scraps and put them together and then cut the pieces out. Mm-hmm. I challenge you to find where I did that because I didn't want to waste it. I just needed like 3 or 4 more pieces of a certain color. I put them together, pressed my seam allowances open, used it as one piece, and just kept going.
Yep.
If the quilts that are in museums and are antiques and thought of as charming could be done that way, why can't we be charming?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, if all of your pieces are consistently too small, that just means your final quilt is going to be a little bit smaller, but who cares if no one's going to come up and measure it to make sure it was the size the pattern said it was supposed to finish at.
Exactly. Mostly it's going to be non-quilters seeing it anyway. They won't know the difference.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Next one. Susan says, how do I avoid the V in the fabric when I cut strips from folded fabric? I always call that the elbow.
Yeah, you get a little wedge going on in the middle and you open up your strips.
Yep.
The biggest thing with that is to open out the fabric to start with. Try to get that press out of the center, that crease if you can, and then refold it. Hold it up, making sure that your selvages are matched. And you may have to slide one or the other as long as it's totally hanging straight and doesn't have a kind of a diagonal wrinkle across it. That's where you get that V. So trying to adjust, because sometimes we get fabric from the shops, and I work in a shop. We unroll the fabric, we cut off a piece, and we sell it to you. People will want to use that as the perfect straight of grain or straight edge, but it may not be. It may have been on the bolt a little skewed, because when you're rolling up 15 yards, think about when you roll up a towel from your bathroom. Everything shifts just a little. And same thing can happen with fabric when it's rolled onto a bolt. They can shift a little. So go back, unfold it, realign those selvage edges, look for that fold, try to get it to hang as straight as possible, and try to make that new cut across so that it try to avoid that V in the middle.
Yep. Absolutely. And we actually have a video on National Quilter Circle where our other instructor, Heather Thomas, is demonstrating exactly what you're saying. So we need a visual on the whole holding up the fabric, and she makes it really off so you can see that little ripple you're talking about, and then shows how to adjust it to get it back straight. But then, I mean, even if I did that, I would always recut a new edge anyway. And because sometimes when you get it, depending on where you're shopping from, they're not using a rotary cutter and a mat. They're using scissors, and it's a choppy edge anyway. You need to straighten it up and square it up anyway. So you might as well just get yourself a good starting, nice cut.
Yep.
Yep.
Bite the bullet and get it straight.
Exactly. All right. Misty says, "Hi, I'm excited to learn from your show. I find that sometimes when I'm sewing my pieces together, the machine bunches up the thread under the fabric. It doesn't make sense when it was running fine. This can mess up my fabric, and I need to try and cut the extra thread that has been bunched up. So what would cause that?"
Had that happening just the day before yesterday. I think that usually what it is that the tip of the needle is dulled. It may be that you've been piecing a while and that tip is getting dulled. I was working on batik fabric, and there are a lot of dyes and inks on batik fabric, and they're very rough on that sharp point of the needle. And I was having the exact same thing, that if I didn't start in just like 1/8 of an inch, everything was bunching up underneath my needle, and it would be like forcing it down into the bed of my sewing machine even, and I'd be like, oh, frustrated. So change out the needle, see if that helps. Also, see if it's the right size needle for the fabric you're working on. You may need a little bit finer needle on batik to get through all the inks and paints that are on the fabric. If it's a little looser weave, you might be able to get by with a 14, but you might need a 12. Mm-hmm. Change the size of the needle, put in a new one. So that will probably solve most of the issue. If it continues to happen, put in a leader or an ender. People talk about making quilts by doing this, but if you have just scraps of fabric underneath the presser foot, let it stitch a little bit on that, and then put your next piecing patchwork right up next to it so that it doesn't stitch into nothing. And then it'll take a nice bite and continue on. Yeah. Some machines don't have that issue. Others, they like to eat fabric. They don't like to sew into air. And so that little bit of spider or leader or ender, whatever you want to call it, under the needle may help you jump onto your patchwork and not have that chewing up effect on the edge of your block.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, our next question here, how do you decide what kind of batting to use on your quilt? I've even heard some talk recently of doubling the batting in quilts. Why and when might you choose to do that?
Okay. So the majority of time when I hear somebody talk about doubling, we'll talk about that one first, is that they're using maybe a cotton batting and then they're layering a wool batting over the top to get that really fluffy effect. They want a fluffier quilt, or to even do like double layer of poly if you want it to look more like a comforter than a traditional flat quilt. So that's when you might see those doubling ups to get a different effect in the quilting. When it comes to picking the batting for the project, there are a lot of things to take into consideration. Sometimes when you're making a quilt, maybe it's for a baby quilt. It's something that a toddler's you want them to be able to drag around at nap time. Consider putting in a lighter weight batting, maybe a poly batting. It doesn't add weight. It doesn't add drying time. Because if it's a nap quilt and it's a really young child, that quilt may need to get washed repeatedly in time for nap time, and a poly bat will dry really fast. Mm-hmm. So that might be a consideration there. If you want a very traditional looking quilt, 100% cotton, or a blend of 80-20, 70-30, some combination of poly cotton will give you a very traditional, flatter appearance. If you're working on, say, an Amish quilt, it's created with a lot of dark colors and a lot of black background. You may want to use a black batting just so you don't get any bearding or white pulling through. So a black batting could be something that you may go after in those cases. If you want the quilt to be very warm, or you're going to be doing hand quilting, a wool batting may be your choice. Wool batting is very easy to hand quilt through. It's very lightweight. It's very warm. So you really need to consider the use of the quilt, who it's going to be used by, how fast it maybe needs to be dried, the colors of the quilt, and then cost is the last factor to think about too. Because if you go into wool battings, those are more expensive, 100% cotton, more expensive. Right now, it might just be availability. As everyone knows, availability on some products can be a little delayed. So you may end up going to a second choice or trying something you haven't tried before. There are battings that are made out of recycled products. There are battings made out of bamboo. So this might be the time to try something different.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, next one here. Misty says she's struggling with connecting the two ends of the binding. I have a tool that is acrylic, but it's confusing to cut at an angle with limited fabric. I sometimes cut too short or long. Is there an easier way to do this accurately?
This is kind of the bugaboo. Getting the binding joined together nicely and seamed, if you're trying to do by machine, can be a challenge. There are tools out there, and they are produced by a variety of different people. I tend to use none of them. Years ago, I remember watching an episode by Alex Anderson, and she showed how she finished starting and ending her binding, and I jumped on board, and I've done that ever since. And state fair judges, don't tell anybody, state fair judges haven't had a problem with it. So I've always gotten good comments on my binding, so don't tell them, okay?
Okay. Yeah, no one will ever see this. Don't worry.
Don't ever tell anybody. Let's see if I can find a binding strip that I can demo quick. Okay, there's always leftover binding sitting in your sewing room, right? When you prepare your binding, you fold it in half, you cut 2.5 or 2.25 inch strips, you go to the iron and you press it in half like this. You have a fold and you have raw edge. What I do is I prepare the beginning point and I fold so I get a 45-degree angle. I press this and then I press this close. And what I'm creating is kind of a tunnel, okay? And I go back and I would cut away this extra triangle down here so that there's a seam allowance on the inside of my binding. But that's where I'm going to begin applying my binding to my quilt top, so that this has all been prepared so that when I come around my quilt and back in, I'm going to cut a piece. Once I get going, let's find the other end here. I come around to the end of my quilt. I'm going to be just inserting this. Now remember, I'm going to put this on I'm going to leave this part a little bit free, okay? So that when I come back around, I can insert the ending piece, figure about how much fabric it's going to take to tuck in there, and then take it out and I cut it, and then insert it back, and then continue on stitching the binding down. Now, yes, this is an open seam that's not stitched by machine, but if you're a person who goes back later to turn the binding by hand and stitch this down, this is my starting point. I come in with my needle and my thread and I close the back side, and my thread is in position now so that I can turn my binding and do the stitching on the back of my quilt. Because I'm going to be hand stitching anyway, I can close that little diagonal by hand. Doesn't take a tool. I don't have to go find it. I don't have to remember to leave long pieces so that I can try to manipulate them and then twisting them and then have to take it out, because yes, I've done that. And it's always been for me the way to finish. And I thank Alex Anderson for her technique, because I didn't have to go find a tool. I didn't have to mark anything. Didn't have to draw a line. I just needed to prepare the beginning so that I had like a tunnel for my tail to go into later. Come all the way around, tuck it in and trim, and then hand stitch it down. So thanks to her, I've always gotten good marks on my binding. So
good. I like that technique, because I think a lot of people have done, just the basic overlap, but this is giving you the overlap, but with the diagonal seam that you want to make it look like it was done. So I have to say, the way that I always did it, me, I like to have someone else bind anytime I can, but if I have to do my own, I do, do the whole leave the long tails, overlap them by however wide the binding is, and then do that L seam join, just like you would put all your pieces together. And I learned that one from watching Mary Fonz used to have a show called Quilty, and I watched her do that, and she had a guest on who showed, you have to fold it the right way and line them up the right way. So it does. But so if that video, I'm sure it still exists somewhere.
It does.
Yes. So that's the one I years ago watched that one, and that's where I learned it from. So good old Mary Fonz video.
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Nancy just says, I just made a baby quilt top. As I was ironing the custom fabric backing, I saw a thread, pulled, and now I have a little run. What can I do to stabilize it? It is in the center of the fabric.
At that point, the best thing you can do is probably just to, if you can find either a self-threading needle with a slot and get it buried back inside into the batting. If it's a run that where it's pulled and the ink of the fabric now shows a little line, it may just have to stay that way. You can play with it a little bit to try and loosen up those fibers to get them back in line. But sometimes the more you work on those kinds of things, the more noticeable it is. And that quilt is going to be loved no matter what. So don't clip off that little fiber that came out. Just get it tucked back inside to the binding. It'll wear fine. So,
yep. And then if you can still see that little like empty space from where the thread used to be, you just use your fingernail and kind of like get them back. Yeah, back together. All right, our next one here. Do you recommend washing fabric before cutting? Your favorite question.
My favorite questions. I am too impatient to put all my fabric in the washing machine first. And I don't like ironing because you would have to go back and press all that fabric. So I tend not to. Now, I will qualify that with that the majority, probably 98% of the fabric that is in my fabric stash comes from a quilt shop. So it is a higher level printing process. It's a higher grade of gray goods, which means the base fabric that it's printed on. And it's fairly new so that the inks are stable. Yeah. There have been times I know that people have bought fabric and they had it run and crazy things happened with the inks and shrinkage that was uneven. It happens. I tend to use color catcher or some kind of product in my washing machine to grab that loose inks and dyes and keep from it migrating to the wrong place in the quilt. So I am not a pre-washer, but I do know quilters who are. God love them. I cannot wait that long. When that fabric comes home, it's going to the cutting table.
Yeah. I'm the same way. And I literally boxes, I have in my laundry room, boxes of color catchers right next to dryer sheets, just make it a staple and you'll be good.
Yep.
All right. I've just started a rag quilt for my granddaughter and I have so many mistakes that I'm concerned it will look off after I wash it. What do you suggest?
In a rag quilt, you can hide a lot of things. In fact, I have a rag quilt out right now because I'm going to use denim to make picnic blankets at Christmas time. So I've been cutting up old blue jeans. This is the most forgiving process there is in quilting.
Yes.
If it's off by a little, it's not going to matter. Especially in the clip, when you go to clip everything, it's going to hide a lot. So when you put pieces together, they shifted a bit and it's a 1/4 inch longer on one side on the other, no one's ever going to know once it's washed because that rag's up on that edge. It's impossible to find those mistakes. Yeah. I would say the biggest thing you want to stay a little bit accurate, though, is when you're putting the blocks together, try to stay as straight as you possibly can there. If one fabric is shifted, keep in mind that piece shifted where your seam allowance, if it's 1/2 inch or whatever you're using as exposed seams, keep an eye, if you have to even draw a line in for yourself so you connect those properly. Because the backside, you can see where block to block goes. But if those outer edges have shifted a lot, no worry. It's all going to be good in the laundry.
It is. This person might be worried about it looking off after you wash it, but that's when it's going to look better. Like, I feel like as soon as you get a rag quilt done and you've done all of the clipping, it just looks odd. It's too perfect. It's too, and as soon as you wash it, it just looks exactly like it's supposed to, looks like what you want it to, gives it that look, Yep. Yeah, perfect. All right, our next one here. If you do not have a long arm or money to get your quilt done by someone else, what is the best way to get a finished look?
Well, patience. Time and patience. I would say study, go through YouTube videos, learn the most you can about machine quilting on your domestic sewing machine. Make sure that you either pin-based well, machine-based well, or spray-based well, because the shifting of layers is going to be your biggest enemy. So if you can stabilize those layers, keeping them together, work on a small space at a time. It may be that if you haven't done a lot of machine quilting, making sure that you're using a walking foot, you may want to just do some simple straight lines, because the machine will help with that straight line, follow the lines of your piecing. That is going to be the easiest at the beginning. A lot of times people will say, but free motion, it would be easy to just make curves and stuff. But if you haven't practiced that a lot, those curves can be something that takes your eye and drives you across the quilt, and then you see every imperfection. So sometimes straight lining with a walking foot is the way to start.
And it doesn't have to always be straight lines. So we've done challenges in the past with Andrea of Happy Cloud Creations, and she calls it straight line quilting, but it's with one of those, it's a meander programs.
A serpentine stitch, kind of wavy. Yes. And I've done ones that I call lazy lines.
Yeah.
I know where I'm heading, but it's not a perfect straight line. It just kind of goes like a lazy river back and forth, not a lot, but just enough so that every line is a little wavy, and in the end, it looks gorgeous.
Yes.
So that you don't have to be straight, because if it's a kindergarten, if it's your beginning piecing, your piecing may not be exactly perfect yet either. And those lazy lines might hide imperfections in your quilting, or in your piecing too. So just think about getting it done, starting in the middle, working your way out. But I would watch some videos so that you kind of get a comfort zone of what it's going to look like, what other people do and how they start. So we share information really well.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, I have to say, we have several videos on National Quilter Circle for this, specifically on things that you mentioned. So one where we have several videos showing different ways to do straight line, or I'm calling it the meander line, wavy line, something like that. Lots of videos on that. And then videos on, you're mentioning basting really well. Mm-hmm. So we have videos on how to just baste a quilt, and specifically videos on how to pin baste a very large quilt, especially if you don't have a large table. You can't do it on your floor. Ways to work in sections and get that whole thing basted. And then, of course, videos on how to deal with a massive, say, queen or king size quilt on your domestic machine. I know a lot of people just have like a bunch it up under there kind of technique. Like to roll it, you kind of have to find what works for you and your machine, but definitely have a bunch of resources available for that. And of course, if all that, you don't want to do any of that, and you only want to work on small spaces, then search quilt as you go techniques and quilt block at a time and then assemble afterwards. So there's definitely a bunch of different ways to get that finished look without having to have a long arm or a long arm or friend.
Correct.
All right, our next one here, Karen says, why, when I'm piecing, does my top fabric get longer as I sew? It really creates a problem when sewing long rows together.
It may be the setting of your machine. You might want to just review the amount of pressure that your presser foot is putting on the fabric. You may need to step up, like even half step at a time, and adjust there. The other thing is that maybe you should pin. I know that's a dirty 3-letter word. Oh no, pins. It does help. And the same thing happens when people are putting borders on quilts. If you're just taking the pieces of fabric, slapping them together and putting them under a machine, the presser foot is going to push the top layer, and it is going to stretch it somewhat. And that can happen. So the best thing to do is, if you've done your patchwork nicely and you're putting two pieces together, pin the beginning, pin the end, pin the middle. And if it's on maybe a 10-inch block, 3 pins might be enough to hold it. But that will keep things so that you can okay, this fabric needs to stay within this range. And as I get to the next pin, take that out, and then it'll keep the next piece together. But that tends to happen sometimes when you've got a long span that you need to sew, but you may need to use a few pins.
Yeah, okay, you might say that it's the three, I don't know. I am an overpinner. I love pinning so much. Like you have binding strips always within your reach. I don't, of course, because I pay someone else to bind my quilts for me, but I have pins everywhere and I'm very specific about the type of pin I use. It has to be a certain one. And it's like, even you're saying 3 pins for a 10-inch square, and I'm thinking, I use 3 pins for a 2-inch square. Yeah, no, I'm literally, because I put so much effort into making sure things are lined up the way I wanted to, making sure points are that I'm like, I don't want anything to shift. So I pin usually at least every inch. I have a pin. And as I sew, I pin to where, if this is my fabric, my pin is going in. So the pin head is out to the right. I'm right-handed. And I just sew and I just pull those pins out as I get up to them. And nothing moves. So that is, but yes, I strongly recommend pinning. But so we're almost towards the end here, so I have to say we have a couple things. We have a download that you can download right now. I believe it should be in a banner either above or below the video you're watching right now. But it's for our Quilting from the Comfort of Your Home calendar. So it's kind of a fun calendar. Kind of walks you day by day through, a Sunday, starting either on a Monday, Sunday, whatever you want to do. But it makes you either start a project or it encourages you to finish a project. So we have, you plan out what you're going to make, and then you pick out your fabric, and then you pick out your design, and it gives you something to do every day of the week so that you actually finish what you start. Colleen, I know you don't do that sometimes. So
I've been working on it.
So you finish a project, or it's a good way to just, maybe if you have a week coming up and you don't have something planned, you can do sort of a quick, easy project and just get this, start to finish done in a week. So kind of a fun little calendar there. But so going off of that, what are you working on right now?
My Bali Breeze was originally supposed to be a throw, and it grew up to be a queen size quilt. So I have the entire top put together. I was contemplating what borders to use and realized that I had purchased fabric when I traveled, and the piece that I had block printed and dyed when we went to the boutique factory. Mm-hmm. And if I don't use it, it'll just end up sitting in the drawer. So I have exactly enough to do an inner border to use up all of that fabric, and then the outer border and binding just happened to be a piece that I did buy, and it goes with it perfectly. So that one is going to be one of the first ones on my long arm when I get it set up this next week.
Perfect. And so this Bali Breeze one, is that a pattern available that we can get from you? I forget.
That was a quilt along that I did with National Quilt Circle. So it's made from strips and a background fabric, and now we're going to have borders, I guess.
How often does that happen? Okay, because we mentioned this before, like 30 minutes ago, if anyone was watching, how we talked about, that sometimes a pattern is really just a strong suggestion. How often do you stick to a pattern and actually complete it 100% what it says, and how often do you maybe deviate from that a little or a lot of it?
I tend to deviate. I tend to go along and get the ideas and inspiration from the pattern, but I tend to, maybe because I worked with a magazine pattern company for a while, it just makes me think, well, I know I can do this or I can do that. So I think it's probably comes with time and comfort in my piecing, so that I can deviate from it and change it up as I go along. So it comes with a little bit of designing desire too. So
yeah, absolutely. So I also design quilt patterns, so I feel like I have the want to change up patterns also. But so say someone's watching and they are making their first or second, or only just started out. How do you give somebody the confidence to make those changes? Or if they think, well, I don't know how to make this block, so how do I know how to change it? So what would you?
Right.
How do you get over that?
Yeah, how do you get through that? If it comes to changing a block, you're going to double check all of your math before you go cutting fabric up. You may even cut the pieces out of paper or color paper and play with those, and remember seam allowances to include afterwards. But do a dummy up or a graph paper drawing first to make sure that's really what you like, because when you put values in different places from what the original pattern started out to be, it can very much change the block. And then if it's block to block, you may get a secondary design you never even thought about. So do a little of that kind of color book coloring ahead of time, plan that. When it comes to changing the math and things, like I love this block, but I want it double size. Again, you better be doing your math, because sometimes it's like, yeah, I can double it, but what about the seam? Don't double the seam allowances.
Right.
You got to think about proportion and accuracy when you're putting things together. But
Yeah.
when it comes to maybe changing sashing or cornerstones, start with easy things like that to change the design a little, and then maybe go into putting things on point and playing that way.
Yeah.
Maybe start with a block you love, so you have the cutting instructions there, but change it in the setting way, in the setting design. That's a good place to start when you're playing with design.
Yeah, absolutely. Or basic changes where if you have a block and within that block it has maybe units that are just a square, make that square into a half square triangle. So now you've just added 2 additional pieces, so you can start with sort of very simple changes and sort of compound on that. And then before you know it, you're going to have designed not only your own block, but you'll have designed your own whole quilt. So
exactly,
just keep going from there. Perfect. Well, awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here to answer everyone's quilting questions and talk with us this month. We'll, of course, probably have you back next month also, unless we have to take another weird month off. No, I'm just kidding. We'll see you. We'll see you back to answer more quilting questions. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.